The sun had barely kissed the horizon when the birds began their symphony of warning. In the ancient village of Dar Salami, 30 kilometers southeast of Bobo Dioulasso, the air vibrated with an urgency that the human ear could barely comprehend. But Mama Diarra could hear it clearly. At 73 years old, the village elder had witnessed 3 coups, 2 famines, and countless seasons of political upheaval in Burkina Faso. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of farming and child-rearing, trembled slightly as she stepped out of her mud-brick home. The birds weren't singing their usual dawn chorus. They were screaming. "Aïcha!" she called to her granddaughter, who was sweeping the courtyard with practiced strokes. "Come here, child, listen." Aïcha paused, her young ears straining. Above them, hawks circled in erratic patterns, their cries sharp and frantic. Yellow weaver birds, usually content to flutter between the acacia trees, darted in chaotic formations. Even the usually silent vultures had joined the cacophony. "What does it mean, grandmother?" Aïcha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mama." Diarra's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with wisdom, scanned the restless sky. "When the birds cry like this, trouble walks among us. Big trouble." Neither of them knew that in less than 4 hours, President Ibrahim Traoré would arrive in their village for what was supposed to be a celebration. Neither could have imagined that this morning would mark the beginning of the most dangerous 24 hours in Burkina Faso's recent history. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the mirror in his private quarters at the presidential residence in Ouagadougou, adjusting the collar of his military uniform. At 34, he was one of Africa's youngest heads of state, having risen to power through a combination of revolutionary fervor, military precision, and an unwavering commitment to his nation's sovereignty. The man staring back at him bore the weight of a country's hopes. His eyes, dark and intelligent, reflected both the determination that had carried him through 2 successful coups and the exhaustion of constant vigilance against enemies both foreign and domestic. "Mr. President." His aide, Lieutenant Sawadogo, entered with a steaming cup of tea. "The convoy is ready. Security has been doubled for today's ceremony." Traoré accepted the tea, inhaling its familiar aroma of ginger and mint. "Any last-minute intelligence reports?" "Nothing significant, sir. The usual chatter about French dissatisfaction with our mining contracts, but nothing actionable." Traoré nodded, though something nagged at him. Since taking power in September 2022, he had navigated through countless assassination attempts, foreign interference, and internal dissent. His rise had disrupted the comfortable arrangement that former colonial powers had maintained with their African satellites. Gold, uranium, and rare earth minerals that had flowed freely to European markets were now being redirected toward partnerships with Russia, China, and other nations offering better terms. This made him dangerous. This made him a target. "Today's ceremony," Traoré said, setting down his cup. "It's more than just opening a community center. These people in Dar Salami have been forgotten by every government before us. They're farmers, herders, small traders. When they see their president come to them, when they see that we're building schools and hospitals instead of just extracting resources, it sends a message. Yes, sir, that Burkina Faso belongs to Burkina. Exactly." Traoré straightened his shoulders. "And that message terrifies those who've grown rich from our poverty." What he didn't know was that 3 days earlier, in a luxurious apartment overlooking the lagoon in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, that very message had prompted a phone call that would set in motion the most sophisticated assassination plot ever attempted on African soil. Kofi Asante was not his real name, but it was the only one that mattered now. In the shadowy world of international contracts and political eliminations, identity was fluid, loyalty was temporary, and survival was the only constant. The apartment in Abidjan's Plateau district was sterile, impersonal, the kind of place where serious business was conducted without leaving traces. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the economic capital of Côte d'Ivoire, but Kofi's attention was focused entirely on the man seated across from him. The Frenchman was tall, pale, with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and older connections. His suit was bespoke, his watch Swiss, his accent refined Parisian, but his eyes were cold as winter rain. "The target has become problematic," the Frenchman said, sliding a thick manila folder across the mahogany table. Inside were photographs, route schedules, security assessments, and a detailed dossier on President Ibrahim Traoré. Kofi opened the folder methodically. He had studied Traoré before. Every professional in his line of work had. The young president was charismatic, militarily trained, and surrounded by loyalists who had followed him through multiple coups. More importantly, he was changing the rules of engagement across West Africa. "The mining concessions," Kofi said, not asking. "Among other things, our clients have invested heavily in certain arrangements. These arrangements are being terminated unilaterally, without proper compensation." Kofi almost smiled. Proper compensation. As if the decades of resource extraction at below market prices had been proper. As if the puppet governments propped up by French military interventions had been legitimate. "The fee," the Frenchman gestured to a briefcase beside his chair, "2 million CFA up front, 3 million upon completion. Clean. Exit guaranteed. 5 million West African francs, roughly $8,000 US. It was a modest sum for eliminating a head of state, which meant either his employers were confident of success or they considered Traoré's removal a foregone conclusion. Timeline? "The target will be in Dar es Salaam tomorrow morning for a public ceremony. Rural setting, limited security, predictable routes, optimal conditions." Kofi studied the aerial photographs of the village. Small, isolated, with only 2 main access roads. The community center where the ceremony would take place was a simple building with clear sight lines from multiple elevated positions. From a tactical perspective, it was indeed optimal. But something felt wrong. In 15 years of contract work across 4 continents, Kofi had developed an instinct for operations that seemed too easy. Professional paranoia had kept him alive when others had made fatal assumptions. "Inside help?" he asked. The Frenchman's smile was barely perceptible. "That has been arranged." This was the detail that should have reassured Kofi, but instead heightened his unease. Inside help meant complications, witnesses, potential exposure. It also meant his employers had resources beyond what the fee suggested. "I'll need 48 hours for reconnaissance. Time is a constraint. The window is tomorrow." "Morning, during the ceremony. Accept or decline now." Kofi looked again at the photographs. Traoré was young, idealistic, genuinely popular among his people. In another life, in different circumstances, Kofi might have respected him. But respect was a luxury that professionals in his field couldn't afford. He closed the folder. "I'll need transportation to Bobo Dioulasso tonight, and a secure communication device." The Frenchman reached into his jacket and produced a satellite phone, sleek and unmarked. "Your local contact will reach you at 2200 hours. Code word, Harmattan." As Kofi pocketed the device, he caught his reflection in the apartment's window. A middle-aged man with unremarkable features, the kind of face that disappeared in crowds and left no impression on witnesses. Perfect for his profession, but somehow hollow. "One question," he said. "Why not use local assets exclusively?" "Because," the Frenchman replied, standing to signal the meeting's end, "local assets can develop emotional complications. You, Mr. Asante, are purely professional." Professional. The word followed Kofi as he left the apartment and made his way through Abidjan's bustling streets. Professional meant detached, reliable, efficient. Professional meant that somewhere in Burkina Faso, a young president who genuinely loved his country would be dead within 18 hours. As he boarded the evening flight to Bobo Dioulasso, Kofi tried to ignore the nagging sensation that this contract was different from the others. But in the world of international intrigue, intuition was often the difference between success and catastrophe. Captain Yaya Sawadogo had served beside Ibrahim Traoré for 6 years. They had stormed government buildings together during the first coup, shared meals during long military campaigns, and trusted each other with their lives on countless occasions. Traoré had been best man at Yaya's wedding. Yaya had been the first person to salute Traoré as president. Now, as he sat in his modest apartment in Ouagadougou's military quarter, Yaya stared at the satellite phone that would destroy everything they had built together. The device had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered by a courier who claimed to be from military intelligence. Inside the package was a brief note. "Your sister's medical bills have been covered. Full payment for your service will follow completion of assignment. Instructions to follow." Yaya's sister, Aminata, suffered from a rare kidney condition that required expensive treatment unavailable in Burkina Faso. For months, Yaya had watched her deteriorate while he struggled to arrange medical care abroad. The family had exhausted their savings, sold their ancestral land, and borrowed against future harvests. Still, it hadn't been enough. Then came the miraculous news. An anonymous benefactor had paid for Aminata's treatment at a private clinic in Abidjan. The surgery had been successful, the recovery was progressing well, and all future medical expenses would be covered. The family was saved. The price was Ibrahim Traoré's life. The satellite phone buzzed. Yaya's hands shook as he answered. "Harmattan winds blow strong this season," the voice said in heavily accented French. "But the rains will come," Yaya replied, using the code phrase he had memorized. "Tomorrow's ceremony. You understand your role?" Yaya's mouth was dry. "I understand. The target will be eliminated by external assets. Your role is to ensure the backup plan succeeds if the primary fails. Internal security must be compromised at the crucial moment. And if I refuse?" The silence stretched for long seconds. Then, "Your sister's condition is delicate. Medical accidents are unfortunate but not uncommon." Yaya closed his eyes. Aminata was only 22 years old, bright, ambitious, planning to become a teacher. She trusted him completely, called him her hero. How could he explain that her hero was about to commit the ultimate betrayal? "There will be collateral damage," he said. "Regrettable but necessary. The target has been classified as a threat to regional stability." Regional stability. The euphemism was almost laughable. Traoré's crime wasn't threatening stability. It was threatening the profit margins of multinational corporations and the political influence of former colonial powers. "Understood," Yaya said. "Excellent. Await further instructions." The line went dead. Yaya sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, the weight of his decision settling over him like a funeral shroud. Tomorrow, he would stand beside his president, his friend, his brother-in-arms. And when the moment came, he would step aside and let death claim the man who had lifted Burkina Faso from decades of exploitation and humiliation. But Aminata would live. That had to count for something. At 4:47 a.m., approximately 2 hours before President Traoré's convoy would begin its journey to Dar Salami, something extraordinary happened in the skies over Burkina Faso. Dr. Amara Ouedraogo, an ornithologist at the University of Ouagadougou, had been conducting a routine migration study when her instruments detected unprecedented avian activity. Birds from across the region, species that rarely interacted, some that were natural enemies, were converging on a single point, the village of Dar Salami. "This is impossible," she muttered, reviewing the radar data from her research station. "Different species, different flight patterns, different territories. They should be competing, not coordinating." Her research assistant, a graduate student named Musa, peered over her shoulder at the screen. "Could it be related to weather patterns? Atmospheric pressure changes?" Dr. Ouedraogo shook her head. "I've been studying bird behavior for 20 years. This is something else entirely. She thought of her grandmother's stories about birds that could sense danger, that served as messengers between the physical and spiritual worlds. As a scientist, she had always dismissed such tales as folklore, but the data on her screen suggested that perhaps there was more to those old stories than she had imagined. Musa, contact the meteorological service. Check for any unusual atmospheric conditions over Dar es Salaam, and she hesitated, knowing how her next instruction would sound. Contact the president's security detail. Tell them about the bird activity. Dr. Wedraogo, they'll think we're crazy. Maybe. But if I'm right, if the birds are responding to some kind of environmental stress or unusual activity in the area, it could be important. As Musa reached for the phone, Dr. Wedraogo continued studying the radar patterns. The birds weren't just flying toward Dar es Salaam, they were circling, forming complex patterns that resembled military formations. It was as if nature itself was preparing for war. By 9:30 a.m., the village of Dar es Salaam was transformed. Colorful banners hung between buildings, drummers warmed up their instruments, and women in vibrant traditional dress prepared local delicacies for the presidential visit. Children waved small Burkina flags, their excitement palpable as they awaited their first glimpse of the young leader who had become a hero to many. But above the celebration, the sky told a different story. Thousands of birds had gathered, hawks, soaring in tight circles, weaver birds darting between trees, crows perched on rooftops like sentinels. Their calls created a symphony of agitation that seemed to build with each passing minute. Mama Diarra stood at the edge of the crowd, her ancient eyes tracking the aerial display. "Aicha," she said to her granddaughter, "find the village chief. Tell him the spirits are restless today." "Grandmother, it's just birds. Just birds don't gather like this, child. Something is coming, something bad. Chief Burema Kabore, a portly man in his 50s who wore both traditional robes and a modern wristwatch, was busy directing the final preparations when Aicha delivered her grandmother's message. He glanced up at the sky, frowning at the unusual avian activity. "Tell your grandmother I appreciate her concern, but the president will be here soon. We can't postpone based on bird behavior." But as the morning progressed, even the most skeptical villagers began to notice the increasingly agitated calls from above. Vendors setting up their stalls paused to watch the circling birds. Musicians found their drums being pecked at by bold crows that showed no fear of humans. Children pointed excitedly at formations that seemed almost military in their precision. At 10:45 a.m., as the sound of helicopter rotors announced the approach of the presidential advance team, the birds' cries reached a crescendo that made conversation difficult. President Traoré's convoy consisted of 6 vehicles, 2 advance cars, with security personnel, the presidential limousine, a modified Land Cruiser painted in the national colors, 2 escort vehicles with additional guards, and a communications van. The procession moved at a steady pace along the dirt road leading to Dar es Salaam, dust clouds marking their progress across the savannah. Inside the presidential vehicle, Traoré reviewed his speech one final time while his personal security chief, Major Karim Ouattara, conducted a final radio check with all units. "Advance team reports all clear," Karim announced. "Perimeter is secure, crowd control is in place, and the community center has been swept twice." Traoré nodded, but his attention was drawn to the unusual sounds coming from outside. Even through the armored glass, he could hear the agitated calls of birds. "That's a lot of noise," he observed. "Probably excited by all the activity, sir," Karim replied, though he too seemed puzzled by the intensity of the sounds. Captain Yahya, seated across from the president, remained silent. The satellite phone in his jacket pocket felt like it weighed 50 kilograms. His orders were clear. When the attack began, he was to protect the president from immediate danger, but ensure that the follow-up succeeded. The moral weight of this instruction was crushing him. As they approached the village outskirts, Traoré rolled down his window slightly to wave at the gathered crowd. The roar of bird calls immediately flooded the vehicle, so loud and chaotic that he quickly raised the window again. "That's not normal," he said, looking up through the sunroof. Above them, hundreds of birds wheeled and dove in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Hawks and eagles, normally solitary hunters, flew in formation with crows and weaver birds. Even vultures, harbingers of death in local folklore, had joined the aerial display. "Sir," the driver, Sergeant Bilal, called from the front seat. "Should we radio ahead? Maybe delay the ceremony until whatever's agitating the birds passes?" Traoré considered this. His security training told him that any unusual activity should be treated as a potential threat. But his political instincts warned against disappointing the hundreds of villagers who had been preparing for this visit for weeks. "No," he decided. "We proceed as planned, but everyone stays alert." As they entered the village proper, the crowd erupted in cheers that nearly drowned out the bird calls. Traoré saw the joy on the faces of children who had probably never seen a government official before, let alone their president. Women ululated in celebration, men clapped and sang, and the air filled with the rhythm of traditional drums. This was why he had risked everything to lead the revolution. These people, forgotten by decades of corrupt governments, deserved better. They deserved a leader who would come to them, who would build schools and hospitals instead of just extracting resources for foreign corporations. At 11:10 a.m., the convoy pulled into the village square. The birds overhead reached a fever pitch of activity. Their cries now so loud that some in the crowd began pointing skyward in amazement and confusion. Traoré stepped out of the vehicle, wearing his military uniform and a confident smile. He raised his hand in greeting, and the crowd responded with thunderous applause. But in the trees surrounding the square, on rooftops and power lines, thousands of pairs of avian eyes watched with an intensity that seemed almost human. And high above them all, a lone hawk circled, its piercing cry cutting through the celebration like a warning from the gods themselves. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of one man, but the future direction of an entire nation. At exactly 11:12 a.m., as President Traoré approached the microphone set up on the small stage in front of the new community center, the first shot rang out. Kofi Asante lay prone on the roof of the village school, approximately 150 meters from the target. Through his rifle scope, he had a clear view of the president's head and torso. Wind speed was minimal, visibility was excellent, and his shooting position was stable. It should have been a routine elimination, but as his finger tightened on the trigger, a massive hawk slammed into his back with the force of a stone thrown by a giant. Talons raked across his neck and shoulders as the bird attacked with a fury that seemed almost personal. The shot went wide, striking the ground just meters. From where the president stood, the crack of the rifle immediately triggered chaos. Security personnel shouted orders. Villagers screamed and dove for cover, and Captain Yaya reached instinctively for his sidearm, while simultaneously stepping back from the president, a movement that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Corporal Isaka Diallo, a 23-year-old soldier from Traoré's personal guard, processed the situation with lightning speed. He saw the muzzle flash from the school roof, noted Captain Yaya's suspicious positioning, and spotted something else. A small device that had been thrown from the roof during Kofi's struggle with the hawk. The device was beeping. Without hesitation, Isaka threw himself forward, ripping off his helmet and slamming it down over the improvised explosive device. His body covered the helmet just as the bomb detonated, absorbing the blast that would have killed or severely wounded the president. The explosion threw Isaka across the square like a rag doll. Shrapnel tore through his body armor, and the concussive force shattered bones and ruptured internal organs. But his sacrifice had worked. President Traoré was alive, though shaken and partially deafened by the blast. Through the smoke and confusion, Traoré saw Captain Yaya still frozen in place, his hand hovering near his weapon but not drawing it, not moving to protect his president. In that moment of clarity that sometimes comes in crisis, Traoré understood. The enemy wasn't just on the rooftop. "Karim!" he shouted to his security chief. "Yahya is compromised." But Yahya, realizing his cover was blown, finally drew his pistol, not to defend the president, but to complete his mission. The satellite phone's final instruction had been clear. If the external assets failed, internal resources must finish the job. As Yahya raised his weapon, the birds that had been circling overhead suddenly dove en masse. Hundreds of hawks, crows, and smaller birds descended on the square in a coordinated attack that seemed to target anyone holding a weapon. Yahya was immediately swarmed by angry birds, their claws and beaks tearing at his face and hands. In the chaos, Traoré managed to draw his own sidearm. His shot caught Yahya in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying. Security. Personnel immediately swarmed the wounded traitor, restraining him as he writhed on the ground, covered in blood from multiple bird attacks. "Secure the perimeter," Karim commanded, though his voice was nearly lost in the cacophony of human shouts and avian war cries. On the school roof, Kofi continued to battle the massive hawk that had disrupted his shot. The bird was relentless, its talons drawing blood from his face and arms. But even as he fought, Kofi's professional mind was calculating escape routes and backup plans. He had failed to eliminate the primary target, but intelligence suggested there were other assets in play. The mission might still be salvageable. Managing. To throw off the attacking hawk, Kofi rolled to the edge of the roof and dropped into the alley behind the school. His face was torn and bleeding, his rifle was damaged, but he was mobile. As he ran toward his predetermined extraction point, he activated a small radio beacon that would signal his handlers that Phase 1 had failed. Phase 2 would begin immediately, as medical personnel worked frantically to stabilize the dying corporal, Isaka. President Traoré knelt beside the young soldier who had saved his life. Isaka's eyes were glazed with pain, but his grip on the president's sleeve was still strong. "Sir," he whispered through blood-frothed lips, "it's not just Yahya. The driver, Bilal, he was sweating too much. And the route. Someone changed the route yesterday." Traoré's blood turned cold. If Bilal, his trusted driver of 3 years, was also compromised, then the conspiracy went deeper than a simple assassination attempt. This was a carefully coordinated operation with multiple redundancies. "Karim," he called to his security chief, "detain Sergeant Bilal immediately and check the vehicle for explosives." Major Karim Ouattara, a veteran of multiple conflicts who had never lost a principal under his protection, was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Sir, if the vehicle is compromised, we need to assume the entire convoy is unsafe. I'm calling for emergency extraction." But even as he spoke, Karim was scanning the crowd for other potential threats. The bird attacks had subsided somewhat, but thousands of them still circled overhead like an aerial early warning system. Their behavior was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It was as if they were actively participating in the president's protection. 2 security operatives approached Sergeant Bilal, who was standing beside the presidential vehicle with an expression of growing panic. As they moved to detain him, Bilal suddenly bolted, pushing through the confused crowd toward the village outskirts. "Stop him!" Traoré commanded, but Bilal had a head start and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The chase was brief but decisive. A quick-thinking villager, an elderly man named Musa, who had fought in Burkina Faso's border conflicts in the 1980s, stuck out his walking stick just as Bilal passed. The driver went down hard, his face slamming into the dusty ground. Within seconds, security personnel had him restrained and were searching him for weapons or communication devices. What they found was worse than either: detailed maps of the presidential residence, schedules for upcoming state functions, and a small vial of colorless liquid that field testing would later identify as a sophisticated neurotoxin. How long have you been planning this? Traoré demanded as Bilal was dragged before him. Bilal, his face bloody from the fall, looked up with eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. I never wanted to hurt you, Mr. President, but they have my family, my wife, my children. They showed me photographs of them at school, at the market. They said if I didn't cooperate, who are they? I don't know their real names. French, American, maybe both. They paid well and threatened better, just like they did with the others. What? Others? But before Bilal could answer, a new commotion erupted from the direction of the village school. Kofi Asante, bloodied but still dangerous, had been captured by security personnel as he tried to reach his extraction point. His professional composure had finally cracked under the combined stress of mission failure and sustained bird attacks, as he was dragged into the square. Still bleeding from multiple talon wounds, Kofi began to speak with the rapid, compulsive speech of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. You think this ends anything? He laughed bitterly. You think capturing me stops what's coming? I was just the opening move. There are others, better funded, better connected. They won't stop until you're dead or back in line. Traoré studied the wounded assassin with professional interest. Who sent you? Does it matter? French intelligence, American contractors, multinational corporations, they all want the same thing. A compliant government that knows its place in the global order. And if I refuse to be compliant? Kofi's laugh was sharp and humorless. Then they'll keep coming. Different faces, different methods, but the same objective. You've disrupted too many profitable arrangements, made too many powerful people nervous. Let them come, Traoré said quietly. We've survived French colonialism, multiple coups, and decades of exploitation. We'll survive this too. But even as he spoke with confidence, Traoré's mind was racing through the implications. If this operation involved multiple conspirators within his own security apparatus, how many others might be compromised? How deep did the conspiracy go? The answer came sooner than he expected. As security personnel conducted emergency sweeps of all government buildings and safe houses, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The assassination attempt in Dar Salami was not an isolated incident, but part of a comprehensive operation designed to eliminate President Traoré and install a more compliant successor. Major Karim Ouattara, working from a secure communications center hastily established in the village chief's compound, received reports that painted a picture of infiltration at the highest levels of government. Sir, he reported to Traoré, we've found evidence of coordinated surveillance on all your regular activities. Someone has been mapping your routines, your preferences, your security protocols for months. Inside information, Traoré concluded, grimly. Yes, sir. The level of detail suggests access to classified security briefings, personal schedules, even private conversations. As if summoned by their discussion, Lieutenant Sawadogo approached with a report that made the conspiracy's scope even clearer. Mr. President, we've intercepted communications from a private aircraft that requested emergency landing clearance at Bobo Dioulasso Airport approximately 1 hour ago. The passenger manifest lists business executives, but the flight originated from a private airfield in Côte d'Ivoire used primarily by intelligence services. Traoré felt the pieces clicking into place. They expected me to be dead by now. The cleanup crew is arriving to manage the aftermath. It appears so, sir. But there's more. Major Boubacar from Presidential Intelligence hasn't responded to any communications since early this morning. His last known location was the capital, but no one has seen him since the ceremony began. Major Ousmane Boubacar had been a trusted member of Traoré's inner circle since the first coup. His intelligence network had helped prevent multiple assassination attempts and exposed several foreign-backed destabilization operations. If Boubacar was involved in the conspiracy, then the security breach was total. Find him, Traoré ordered. Use every resource we have, and assume that everything he knows they know. as teams of loyal security personnel began the hunt for the missing intelligence chief. Traoré reflected on the morning's events. The birds had tried to warn him. Their unusual behavior had been nature's early warning system. But he had nearly ignored that warning, relying instead on human intelligence that had been fatally compromised. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something compelled him to answer. "Mr. President?" The voice was elderly, female, speaking in Moor, the local language of the Mossi people. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Dr. Amara Ouedraogo. I'm an ornithologist at the university. I've been tracking unusual bird migration patterns, and I believe they may be connected to the attack on your life this morning." Traoré frowned. "Connected how?" "Birds are sensitive to environmental changes that humans can't detect. Electromagnetic fields, subsonic vibrations, chemical signatures. The massive gathering over your location suggests they detected some form of threat or unusual activity." "You're saying the birds knew about the assassination attempt?" "I'm saying they detected something that prompted extraordinary defensive behavior. In my 20 years of research, I've never documented anything like what happened today. It's as if they were trying to protect you." Traoré looked up at the sky, where thousands of birds still circled in complex patterns. Their calls had diminished to a steady background chorus, but their presence remained protective, watchful. "Dr. Ouedraogo, I may need your expertise in the coming days. Can you continue monitoring their behavior?" "Of course, Mr. President. But I should warn you, the patterns suggest the threat hasn't passed. If anything, they're indicating increased danger." As Traoré ended the call, Major Karim approached with an update that confirmed Dr. Ouedraogo's warning. "Sir, we've located Major Boubacar. He's driving south toward the Ghanaian border with 2 unidentified passengers. Helicopter pursuit is en route, but he has a significant head start." The end game was beginning, but this time, President Ibrahim Traoré would be ready. The helicopter carrying President Traoré and his remaining loyal security personnel cut through the afternoon sky like a mechanical predator pursuing its human prey across the West African savanna. Below, a black SUV raced along the highway toward the border, carrying secrets that could destroy the revolution and the man who had started it. Major Usman Boubacar sat in the passenger seat, laptop open, frantically deleting files and communication records. Beside him, the driver, a French intelligence operative using the cover identity of a telecommunications consultant, spoke rapidly into a satellite phone. "The package is compromised," he said in rapid French. "Initiate contingency protocols. Full sanitization required." In the back seat, a third man, older and better dressed, reviewed a thick folder of documents. These papers contained the complete operational plan: assassination protocols, successor candidates, economic restructuring plans, and lists of government officials who had been identified as cooperative assets. "How long until we reach the border?" Boubacar asked, his voice tight with stress. 20 minutes, the driver replied. "But they're gaining on us." Above them, the helicopter's occupants were having a different conversation. President Traoré studied the vehicle through binoculars, while Major Karim coordinated with ground units and border security. "They're heading for the Paga border crossing," Karim reported. "If they reach Ghana, diplomatic complications could prevent immediate extradition." "Then we don't let them reach the border," Traoré replied grimly. But even as the helicopter closed in on its target, something extraordinary was happening in the sky around them. The birds that had protected Traoré in Dar Salami had followed the chase, forming a massive aerial convoy that stretched for kilometers. Hawks, eagles, crows, and smaller birds flew in formation with the mechanical aircraft, their calls creating a symphony that could be heard even over the rotor noise. "Sir," the helicopter pilot called back, "I've never seen anything like this. It's like they're escorting us." Dr. Amara Ouedraogo, monitoring the situation from her research station, was recording data that would revolutionize the field of animal behavior studies. Her instruments showed thousands of birds moving in coordinated patterns that defied every known principle of avian behavior. Different species, natural enemies, were flying together with military precision. "This is impossible," she whispered to her assistant. "It's as if they understand the political implications of what's happening." On the ground, the fleeing SUV hit a pothole at high speed, causing the laptop to slam shut and scatter the classified documents across the vehicle's interior. Boubacar cursed as he scrambled to collect the papers, knowing that each sheet represented another nail in his coffin if captured alive. "There," the French operative pointed ahead. "The border checkpoint." But their relief was short-lived. As they crested a small hill, they saw that the Ghanaian border post was closed, its gates sealed and heavily guarded. Word had already reached the authorities about the fugitives attempting to cross. "Merde," the driver swore, slamming on the brakes. Above them, the helicopter descended rapidly, its rotors whipping up dust clouds that obscured visibility. But the birds continued to circle, their cries growing more intense, as if sensing that the confrontation was reaching its climax. President Traoré rappelled from the helicopter with 2 security operatives, landing just as Boubacar and his companions emerged from the SUV with their hands raised. The birds overhead seemed to respond to his presence, their formation tightening into a protective spiral. "Ousmane," Traoré said quietly, using his former ally's first name. "Why?" Boubacar, his uniform disheveled and his face etched with exhaustion, met his president's gaze without flinching. "Because I believed in the revolution at first. I believed we could change everything, create a better future for our people. But then I realized how naive we were." "Naive how? You think you can challenge the entire global system? Break free from centuries of established relationships?" "They have unlimited resources, Mr. President, unlimited patience. They will never stop coming." The French operative, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, tried to step forward. "I have diplomatic immunity." "You have nothing, Major," Karim interrupted, pressing a rifle barrel against the man's chest. "You're on sovereign Burkina soil, in violation of multiple international laws." Traoré continued focusing on Boubacar. "So you decided to help them kill me?" "I decided to help you see reason. The plan was to remove you cleanly, install General Dai Zongo as interim leader, and negotiate a managed transition back to democratic governance. Your death would have made you a martyr, and the country would have eventually stabilized under more practical leadership. Practical meaning compliant, meaning realistic about our place in the world order." Traoré studied his former intelligence, chief with a mixture of disappointment and pity. "And in this new world order, what happens to our gold mines, our uranium deposits, our agricultural land?" Boubacar's silence was answer enough. The older man in the expensive suit finally spoke, his English accent cultured and cold. "Mr. President, you're fighting an unwinnable war. The economic pressures alone will eventually force Burkina Faso back into compliance. We're offering you a chance to manage that transition with dignity." "And if I refuse?" The man smiled thinly. "Then you'll discover that there are many ways to destabilize a government. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, support for opposition, groups, media campaigns questioning your legitimacy. The methods are subtle but effective." Traoré looked up at the birds still circling overhead. "You know what I've learned today? Sometimes the most important warnings come from unexpected sources. Sometimes nature sees more clearly than human intelligence." As if responding to his words, a massive hawk broke from the formation above and landed on the SUV's hood, its fierce eyes fixed on the 3 conspirators. More birds began landing, on fence posts, power lines, even on the ground around the small group of humans. The British operative looked around nervously. "This is highly irregular. I demand immediate contact with my embassy." "Your embassy doesn't exist here," Major Karim replied. As far as we're concerned, you're an undocumented foreign national involved in an assassination plot against our head of state. Boubacar seemed to realize that his careful plans were completely unraveling. Mr. President, there are things you don't know. Other operations already in motion. Killing me won't stop what's coming. Then tell me what is coming. Economic warfare. They're going to systematically target every international partnership you've developed. Chinese mining contracts will face regulatory challenges in Beijing. Russian military cooperation will be questioned in Moscow. Your African allies will experience sudden diplomatic pressures. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about eliminating one troublesome president. It was about systematically isolating Burkina Faso until compliance became the only option for survival. "How long have you been feeding them intelligence?" Traoré asked. 6 months, since the World Bank's suspension of our development loans. They approached me through intermediaries, offered to help resolve our financial crisis in exchange for cooperation. Cooperation in overthrowing the government you swore to protect. Boubacar's composure finally cracked. "I was trying to save the country. Your revolution is admirable, but it's not sustainable. We're too small, too weak to stand alone against the global system." "Maybe we are too small to stand alone," Traoré agreed. "But we're not alone." As if summoned by his words, the sound of additional helicopters filled the air. 3 aircraft approached from different directions, bearing the flags of Mali, Niger, and Guinea, neighboring countries whose young military leaders had followed similar revolutionary paths. The French operative's face went pale as he recognized the implications. What he had dismissed as an isolated problem in one small country was actually part of a broader movement across West Africa. "The alliance of Sahel states stands together," Traoré announced, referring to the Confederation of Military Governments that had expelled French forces and begun pursuing independent foreign policies. "Attack one of us, and you attack all of us." The British operative was speaking rapidly into his phone, clearly trying to escalate the situation to higher authorities. But his conversation was cut short as Malian security forces emerged from the landed helicopters, surrounding the small group with professional efficiency. Colonel Assimi Goïta, Mali's military leader, approached with a grim smile. "Ibrahim, we received your emergency signal. It seems your friends have been busy." "Too busy," Traoré replied, "and not nearly careful enough." The interrogation that followed would last for days and reveal the full scope of an international conspiracy that reached from corporate boardrooms in London and Paris to intelligence agencies in Washington and Langley. But for now, as the sun set over the West African savannah, President Ibrahim Traoré stood surrounded by allies both human and avian, alive and victorious against forces that had seemed overwhelming just hours before. The birds overhead had begun to disperse, their protective mission apparently complete. But their message remained clear. Some things were worth protecting, some fights were worth fighting, and sometimes the most important allies came from the most unexpected places. 3 days after the failed assassination attempt, President Traoré sat in his private office in Ouagadougou, reviewing intelligence reports that painted a disturbing picture of foreign interference across West Africa. The documents recovered from the conspirators had revealed a network of operations designed to destabilize every government in the region that had begun asserting genuine independence. Major Karim entered with the morning briefings. "Sir, the interrogations have yielded significant information. The operation was coordinated through a private intelligence firm based in London with funding from multiple sources, including mining corporations, defense contractors, and what appeared to be government slush funds. Any evidence of official government involvement? Nothing direct. They were careful to use private contractors and maintain plausible deniability, but the resources involved suggest state-level backing." Traoré nodded grimly. This was the new face of neo-colonialism. deniable operations conducted through corporate networks designed to appear as market forces rather than political interventions. What about our internal security? Captain Yahya and Sergeant Bilal are cooperating fully. Both claim their families were threatened, and both received significant financial incentives. We're reviewing the security protocols for all personnel with access to sensitive information. And Major Boubacar? Karim's expression darkened. Still claiming he was trying to prevent a larger conflict. He's provided detailed information about the network's structure, but maintains he was acting to protect national interests. Traoré stood and walked to his window, looking out over the capital city where life continued its normal rhythm, despite the recent crisis. Children walked to school, merchants sold goods in crowded markets, and people went about their daily lives mostly unaware of how close they had come to losing their independence again. The British operative, demanding consular access and claiming diplomatic immunity, were treating him as an undocumented foreign national involved in terrorism. His real identity appears to be James Morrison, former MI6, currently working for Aegis Risk Management. And the Frenchman from Abidjan? Jean-Claude Mercier, officially retired from DGSE but maintaining extensive contacts. He's been linked to destabilization operations in at least 3 other African countries over the past decade. Traoré turned from the window. What they don't understand is that you can't fight an idea with bullets and bombs. The idea of genuine independence, of African countries controlling their own resources and making their own decisions, that idea is spreading faster than they can contain it. As if to emphasize his point, his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed it was President Brahim Ghali of the Sahrawi Republic, a leader whose people had been fighting for independence from Moroccan occupation for decades. "Brother Ibrahim," Ghali's voice was warm despite the serious circumstances. "We heard about the attack. The Western Sahara stands with Burkina Faso." "Thank you, brother. Your support means everything. We've been monitoring similar patterns in our region. Increased intelligence activity, attempts to infiltrate our organizations, economic pressure campaigns. It appears the old colonial powers are becoming desperate." After the call, Traoré reflected on the broader implications. The failed assassination had been intended to send a message to other African leaders: step out of line and face the consequences. Instead, it had achieved the opposite effect, strengthening solidarity among those fighting for genuine sovereignty. Dr. Amara Ouedraogo's research had become international news. Her documentation of the bird's protective behavior had captured imaginations across Africa and beyond. Social media was filled with images of the aerial formations, and the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Even nature was choosing sides in the struggle for African independence. "Sir," Lieutenant Sawadogo entered with another update. "We've received communications from several African leaders requesting security consultations. It appears your survival has inspired others to review their own protection arrangements." "Good. We need to share what we've learned." But even as Traoré spoke of cooperation and shared security, he knew the real battle was just beginning. The forces arrayed against African independence had unlimited resources and centuries of experience in maintaining control. They would adapt their methods, learn from their failures, and try again. The difference now was that their operations were no longer secret. The Dar Salami incident had exposed their methods to the world, making future interventions more difficult to disguise as internal conflicts or natural political developments. 6 months after the assassination attempt, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, delivering a speech that would be remembered as a defining moment in the struggle for African independence. "The birds of Burkina Faso taught me something that day," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast assembly hall. "They taught me that sometimes the most important truths come from unexpected sources, that nature itself recognizes the difference between justice and oppression, between freedom and exploitation." In the audience, representatives from former Colonial powers sat in uncomfortable silence as Traoré detailed the assassination plot and its international connections. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation complete, and the implications clear. The old system of indirect control was crumbling. Today, I announce the formation of the African Continental Defense Initiative, Traoré continued, a partnership between sovereign nations committed to protecting each other from external interference, economic manipulation, and political destabilization. The applause from the African delegations was thunderous. But more significantly, representatives from Asia, Latin America, and even some European nations joined in, recognizing that the principles at stake extended far beyond Africa. Back in Burkina Faso, the memorial to Corporal Issaka Diallo had become a site of pilgrimage for young Africans from across the continent. His sacrifice had become a symbol of the price of freedom and the courage required to protect it. Dr. Amara Ouedraogo's research station had been expanded into an international center for the study of animal behavior and environmental awareness. Her work on the Dar Salami incident had opened new fields of research and challenged assumptions about the relationship between human political activity and natural systems. The birds still came to Dar Salami. Every morning at sunrise, they gathered in the sky above the village, circling once in what had become known as the Freedom Flight, before dispersing to their daily activities. Tourists, researchers, and pilgrims came from around the world to witness this daily reminder of the day when nature itself had chosen sides in the struggle for human dignity. Mama Diarra, now recognized as a local hero for her early warnings, often told visitors, "The birds knew what was coming because they could see the truth clearly. Sometimes we humans make things so complicated that we forget to listen to the simple truths around us." Captain Yahya and Sergeant Bilal had been sentenced to life imprisonment, but were serving their terms in minimum security facilities while participating in reconciliation programs. Both had become advocates for transparency in government and warnings about the vulnerability of officials whose families could be threatened or bribed. Major Boubacar had died in prison, officially of a heart attack, though many suspected suicide. His final letter, published posthumously, warned of the psychological pressure faced by officials caught between loyalty to their country and fear for their families' safety. Kofi Asante, the assassin, had been exchanged for 3 Burkinabe intelligence operatives held in Côte d'Ivoire. His current whereabouts were unknown, but intelligence reports suggested he had retired from contract work and was living quietly in a small town in Ghana, haunted by the memory of birds that had seemed to possess human intelligence. The International. Conspirators had been tried in absentia and sentenced to life imprisonment if they ever set foot on Burkinabe soil. More importantly, their methods had been exposed and documented, making similar operations more difficult to organize and execute. President Traoré, now recognized as one of Africa's most important leaders, continued to face threats and challenges. But he also enjoyed unprecedented international support and a growing network of allies committed to genuine sovereignty and mutual respect. The revolution that had begun with military coups and political declarations had evolved into something larger, a fundamental shift in how Africans saw themselves and their place in the world. The birds of Burkina Faso had witnessed the beginning of that transformation, and their message had been heard around the world. In the end, the assassination plot had failed, not just because of good security or international support, but because it had underestimated the power of an idea whose time had come. The idea that every people deserved to control their own destiny, to benefit from their own resources, and to choose their own path forward. Sometimes the most important revolutions begin with the simplest truths, and sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, we can hear those truths in the songs of birds circling overhead, warning us of danger and promising us hope. The fight for genuine African independence continued, but it was no longer a lonely battle, fought by isolated leaders against overwhelming odds. It had become a movement, supported by nature itself and witnessed by the world. and in the skies above Burkina Faso, the birds continued to fly free.